All right. And let me just start a stopwatch. Let me just reset this. There we go. Cool. Welcome, everyone. My name is Joe Previtt, and today we're going to have some fun learning how to navigate a TypeScript codebase using open source. So, the first thing I want to start with is a question for everyone. So, just by a show of hands, who here has been taught how to navigate a codebase? Not very many people. Yeah. So it's not something that's, at least from what I've seen, it's not something that's talked about too often. And it's also not something that, many people learn how to do. But it's a valuable skill, right? At least I think so. I mean, if we look at some use cases, why would you want to learn this? Well, so the first one, onboarding. You join a new company, you got to learn a new code base. You're at a company and they switch you to a new project. You got to learn a new code base. So, onboarding, whether within your current company or at a new company, that's a great example of where this skill would come in handy. Another one. So, I would guarantee that 99% of the code bases that you work in have code written by other people. So, by that, I mean third party code, whether that's code from the open source world or code that you've bought or acquired. I don't know, maybe through an acquisition, actually. So if we think about those two use cases and we think about this skill of navigating a code base, this is something that I would say is useful to everyone who's here in the room with us today. But the thing is, how do you do it, right? What is that formula? What are the things that you need to be able to do that will help you navigate a code base, right? What's the secret formula? And so that's kind of what today's talk is about. Can we, using open source, reverse engineer this skill of navigating code bases? And specifically today, we'll be looking at a TypeScript code base. And so the way that we're going to do that, one, I mentioned open source, but specifically time travel. So what do I mean? We are going to search the interwebs of GitHub and see if we can find something that's already been solved in an open source project and use that as our starting point for navigating a code base and reverse engineering this formula. So the reason that we're going to do it this way is because when you're navigating a code base, you really need somewhere to start. You can't just be thrown in, right? I mean, you need a purpose. And so we're going to give ourselves a purpose by solving something that's already been solved. Why? Well, we'll have the context of the issue, we'll have the context of the solution, and so we can use those as starting points to understand a code base rather than starting from scratch. So cool, let's begin our search for a code base. So as you can see, I've kind of narrowed it down so that we have a place to start. So this is just a GitHub global issue search. I've got some parameters up here. We're looking at issues that are closed and not archived. We're limiting it to the GitHub org testing library. So I'm sure some of you are familiar with React testing library. I found that this code, it's familiar, it's relatable because, I'm sure some of you are using some of these libraries at work. So I thought it would be applicable to all of you today. The other thing we're looking at is label, right? So we want to keep it basic. We're trying to figure out this formula. We don't want to get too complex. So we're looking for good first issues. And the last thing, again, we want the issue to already be solved. We don't want to be starting from scratch and trying to figure out an issue. That might be the next step after you figure out this formula if you want to contribute to open source. But for today, we want something that's already been solved. So if we scroll down, oh, perfect. Okay, so I've written a custom React hook. I'm sure some of you have as well. So there's this library, React Hooks Testing Library. So let's click on this issue. I also know SSR, so that's great. So this person says, hey, is there any way to test SSR functionality in an environment close to real SSR? So this is a library for testing your custom React hooks. It sounds like this person has some sort of hook that has a check to operate one way based on a server-based environment. So, maybe this hook is being used in both, say, a Create React app and maybe a Next.js, a server-side rendering environment. And so they've got an issue down here, right? Reference error document is not defined. So this is from a year ago. So again, we're traveling back in time here. So now if we come down, we have a reply from, looks like, a maintainer. So they say, hey, thanks for raising this. I think this is being caused by this line. Okay, so we have a bug. We know what the error is. And now the maintainer has told us kind of where to look. That's kind of, putting ourselves in the shoes of this author of this issue. So we come down, and it looks like they raised a PR, which is great. So again, we're still in that phase trying to figure out, is this a good candidate for us for our learning experiment of us trying to figure out how do we navigate a new code base. So if we look at files changed, pretty small diff. So I would say that's probably a good candidate for us. And there's actually only one file that's changed, source server pure, because the other stuff, readme, all contributors, don't need to worry about that. So it's a pretty small change. So I would say this is a great candidate for us learning how to navigate a code base. So if we come in, they have a description here. Didn't change coverage, so they probably didn't add a test. Yeah, it would be nice if we could do some server-only tests. So they did something, okay, but they didn't add any tests. Cool, okay. So I think that's fine. So the next thing we want to do is actually travel back into time and put the code base, when we clone it, into a state where this issue exists, where this bug existed. So the way that I know how to do that, or the fastest way, is to go to the merge commit and then go to the parent commit. So we'll copy that, and now what we'll do is clone this locally and start diving in. And so I've already done this to save us some time. So let me zoom in for y'all. Now what we're going to do is start to navigate this code base and see if we can figure out a formula. So the first thing that comes to mind for me is folder structure. So if we look at the folder structure, what do we see? What's kind of this overall picture? How's this organized? So we've got the root, we've got a bunch of config files. That's normal. We probably want to dive into source. So now, kind of looking at this from afar, what do we see? We've got core, DOM, helpers, native, server, and types. So helpers, that's pretty self-explanatory. Tests, pretty self-explanatory. Core, I guess core part of the module. But then we have DOM, native, and server. I wonder what that could be. So I guess if you think about it, it's kind of like environments, right? You've got a DOM environment, like a browser. You've got a server environment, so like Node. And then you've got native. So maybe this can be used with React Native. I mean, it is React hooks, so probably. So now we've kind of got this idea of how the folders are structured, right? If you look inside, each of them has like an index and a pure, and they've got this test directory. Cool. Okay. That seems to make sense. The next thing we want to look at is the code that we're touching. So remember, the maintainer, this person, Michael, gave us a hint. Hey, this is probably where this issue is coming from. And if we go back to the PR, and we look at the files changed, we know that the solution was in this source server pure. So let's go there next. Cool. So I'll hide that. Okay. So now we can kind of look at this file that we're going to be working with. So we've got some, pretty standard TypeScript, JavaScript stuff. You've got your imports. We've got a function here called create server renderer. So again, like React renderer. We've got renderer props, some sort of wrapper, props, hydrated. Okay. So again, it's server environment. So there's probably something to do with hydrating the app on the client. We've got a container, a div, cool. Some sort of like test harness. Okay, cool. We've got a render method. This act thing, it's the server output, React DOM server, render to string. Okay, so it's rendering the React DOM to a string and then populating this container. Okay. Patch, setting error, that's fine. Hydrate. Okay. So kind of have a basic idea. We've got these methods, hydrate, render, re-render, unmount. Okay, those seem familiar if you're familiar with React. Cool, so we talked about folder structure. We looked kind of at the code that we're touching. Next thing is probably types, right? Because this is TypeScript, so we can learn some stuff from the TypeScript definitions. Okay, so if you look at this line, import render props and render options from types React. Okay, let's go see. I remember seeing that types folder. We've got these two files. And so if we pull back up here, there's two things, render props and render options. So render options is just kind of like this object with a wrapper, which is optional. Okay, so how you want to render it, I guess, a wrapper component. What was the other one? Render props. Okay. So if we do a search for that, okay, cool. So render props. So there's these props, I guess, for the renderer callback. So, some sort of function that gives a result. Set error. So if there's an error, we saw that called in a set value. We got the set error. I don't know if the set value is even used. No. Okay. Okay. So a little bit more information, right? Props and options for the renderer, right? Because this is some sort of render for these custom hooks. So rendering them, I guess, in some sort of test harness. Okay, so we've looked at folder structure. We've looked at the code that we're touching this file. We've looked at types. The last thing I guess we could look at is tests, right? You can learn a lot from tests. So let's just look at this custom hook. Okay, so custom hook tests. So if you're familiar with Jest, this should look pretty familiar. They define a custom hook called useCounter, pretty basic. And the test says, hey, this should increment counter. So they're calling render hook. They're passing in the useCounter, calling hydrate again, because server environment, these are the server tests. So, they're kind of mimicking that environment. Cool. So now what I want to see if we can do, and I've actually kind of jumped ahead to do this for us, is add a test that reproduces this error that this person saw. Because if you remember, when we looked at their files, they didn't add any tests. So I'm going to see, can we add a test? So now we're taking it a step further, right? So if we go back, and I've done this ahead of time for us, I've added this ssr test.ts. Basically, this verifies that render hook can be called in an SSR-like environment, right? This was the bug that this person ran into. So I wrote a custom hook called useLoading. I added a test block. All I'm saying for my assertion is, hey, I expect this not to throw an error of document is not defined. So, I peeked at the contributing before, and I peeked at the package.json. So I know that if I run yarn test, it should run this new test. And so now let's see. Cool. So if you look at that, here my assertion says I don't want this, but I'm getting it. So now we've effectively reproduced the original bug, which is awesome. So now if I bring this down, so we have our code, what I'm going to do is go into this PR and let's see if we can view this file and just copy it in and see if that works. So if I go to pure, because again, we're just trying to use this as a way to get familiar with the code base. Okay, so it's going to run all those tests. Let's see where our SSR test is, right here. Okay, let's see if this works. So it's running. Cool. And so now you see that it's passing. That's awesome. So I'm just going to stop that. We don't need to wait for the rest to pass. But as you can see, we've kind of used this as a way to learn how to navigate a code base. So let's go back to our slides. Cool. And let me zoom out a little bit. Go back. There we go. Cool. So let's keep going. So let's recap actually what we've done. So we did a little bit of time traveling. We went back, we found an issue from an open source project that was already solved. We used our formula, which I'll recap in a second, but we looked at folders, we looked at the code that we needed to touch, we looked at types, and we looked at tests. So it's kind of the formula that we figured out from this exercise. And then we solved an issue. And so the cool part about this is we actually took it a step further. We took a TDD approach. So we wrote a test because we had some additional knowledge that we could bring to the table. We solved the issue again. And that served as a great way to really get familiar with this new code base. And so again, to recap that formula, we've kind of figured it out, at least one strategy for navigating code bases. Folder structure, F. So first thing you want to do is kind of get familiar with the folders. How are things structured? How's the code base organized? That's going to be helpful when you're solving different types of issues because you kind of have a map and you can know, okay, if it's related to the server, I'm probably going to want to look at the server folder. Code we're touching. So again, we took an issue that was already solved. We had the code where the bug occurred, thanks to the maintainer, and then we had the code where the fix was implemented. So we knew we went into this, we drew a map, and then we chose a place to start on the map. We looked at types. So this is TypeScript specific for this formula, or this is the TypeScript specific part of the formula. Types. We looked at the types folder, gave us a little bit more information, and we were able to leverage that to help us understand the code base. And then lastly, we looked at tests. And we were able to look at the tests and add a new test. So not only are we learning how to navigate this code base, but we were actually able to improve it. And so that might be a great case to submit a PR upstream, which I'll show you that while I was coming up with this, I actually did. So you'll see here, I actually added that test, which is kind of cool. So here's an acronym to kind of help you remember this formula. FCTT, I think of it as fat cat with testing tubes. So F for folders, C for code you're touching or cat. Types, so the cat has a tattoo of a variable declaration, let my name, and then a type annotation, string equals kitty. And then T, testing, like testing tubes, running in an experiment. So that's it. That's how to navigate a TypeScript code base. Thank you for listening today. I hope you enjoyed that. If you want to connect with me online, you can find me at JSJoIO. I spend a lot of time on Twitter, so come say hey. If you want to learn more about TypeScript, I have a course. It's free right now. It's 3 modules. It's email based, and you can get that at typescriptcourse.com. And lastly, if you want to come say hi after this, I know it's nerve-wracking going up and just starting conversations from scratch. So here's some icebreakers if you want. I have a daughter who's less than a year. I have 2 golden retrievers, my wife and I, and they're part of our family. I'm into indie hacking and Star Wars. So if you want to come say hi, there's some starter topics. Thank you again.